everyone. Thanks so much for your patience. And so glad that we could all tune in now for this broadcast of sharing our stories, Women Against Domestic Violence. I am Elena Ramsey with Sojourners, where we are committed to lifting up the God-given dignity, leadership, and empowerment of women and girls. And so it is a deep honor for me to be able to direct our Women and Girls campaign and to bring this discussion to you today. And I'm very much delighted to be joined by some of our incredible women leaders and partners in this fight to end domestic violence. And so today you're going to hear from Reverend Victoria Ferguson-Young. She's the Executive Director of the Kindred Moxie Network in Atlanta, and she'll be sharing a lot about her great work with engaging faith communities when it comes to domestic violence. We'll also hear from Dr. Andrea Smith, a longtime activist and scholar in gender-based violence against women, and particularly in her work to help free Bresha Meadows, a young survivor of domestic violence. So we'll hear about those efforts and how people of faith can get involved. And also, glad to be joined here today by Reverend Marcia Dinkins, who serves as the Executive Director of the Mahoning Valley Organizing Collaborative in Northeast Ohio, which is my home state. It is a deep honor to be working with Marcia and all that she's doing to organize her communities and make sure that they are responding appropriately to domestic violence and other justice issues in their area. And so a quick word about our series that we launched this fall. We really wanted to focus and feature the stories and the leadership of women of faith, those who are making a difference day in and day out in their communities and contexts. Sojourners, as a Christian media, messaging, and advocacy organization, we're very much committed to sacred storytelling and lifting up the voices of women, particularly those from underrepresented communities. We believe that stories have incredible power. They connect us to one another and the divine in deep and transformative ways. And just to see the movement as a divine among us through the stories that we tell and the ways that we connect through our humanity. And so we wanted to hear how and activists are sharing those stories with one another and connecting the dots between the justice issues and the story of the gospel. And so it's an honor for me to be moderating this discussion with these women who are transforming church and society. And we invite all of you who are tuning in today, you can join us in Faith in Action for Social Justice by sharing your questions and your comments, your experiences about domestic violence. And you can do that by following us via Twitter. Sojourners Women Girls Campaign, we have our own Twitter handle, and it is at Sojo Women, or SOJO Women. Unlike Victoria and Andrea, you can see all their wonderful Twitter handles there. Mine is not up for Sojourners, but you can follow along at Sojo Women. And please do. Throughout the broadcast, if you would, please submit your questions, your comments, so you can direct them to our speakers individually or as a group, and we will be taking those towards the end. And so we're going to start the conversation hearing from each of our speakers, and particularly noting that this is October and that we are nearing the end of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so we wanted to have this conversation with a large audience and recognize that this is not an issue that we need to be talking about in October only, but also beyond that. And so it's great to be with these women who will be sharing their expertise and experiences with us. And so with that, Victoria, if you could start us off, our question to the entire group is, if you each would tell me about a person or a moment in your life that first influenced the work that you do in speaking out against domestic violence.
Well, thank you so much, Elena and Sojourners, for the invitation to be on this webinar today and to talk about this most important issue. For me, you know, there's several things I could talk about, but what I just want to pinpoint for just a couple of minutes is the work that I did as a seminarian, as a student seminarian, when I was at the Interdenominational Theological Center. Back in 2004, 2005, I had the opportunity to do some intern chaplaincy work at what was the Metro State Women's Prison, which is now closed. But in that experience, I got to speak with women who were incarcerated for several reasons. And what was so striking to me is, though I knew that most women who were incarcerated had experienced some type of sexual assault or violence, but all the women that I spoke to over that 5-month period, which was about 8 or so women, each of them had been, but I was talked to weekly, each of them had experienced some type of sexual assault or domestic violence. And that was so startling to me. And yet out of the assault that they face, either as a child, either as an adult, through a partner, through a family member, the violence that they experience, you know, it each traumatized them so deeply. And it seemingly in some way really played a part in them now being in custody at that time. And so that injustice and really witnessing that and listening to that up close in a way that I hadn't before, being inside of a prison, talking to these women candidly, it just ignited in me a passion and a fire to seek to really right this wrong and to do what I could to speak out about it. You know, and from there, I just grew more into the work. I later found out that the other thing I have to mention very quickly that has driven me into this work and to remain a part of it is I later found out that my grandmother was a survivor of sexual assault at the age of 14. And so, to just know that, though she never wanted to talk about it, and I later found out much later that she had experienced that and held it in for so long, it's just another driving force to really seek to eliminate and to stop this cycle and to be a voice for women and women of color in particular who are just experiencing violence and abuse in such staggering rates, that are dying even more so than anyone else, and that are being incarcerated even more so than anyone else. And so when I think about those stories, when I think about the candid stories of trauma and pain that I heard so often, and this became so commonplace, I knew that as someone who was learning to have a platform as a preacher, as a minister, that it was truly an obligation and duty of mine to speak out about this issue.
Amen. Yes, thank you for sharing, Victoria.
No problem.
Dr. Smith or Reverend Marcia Dinkins?
Well, there could be many moments, but in terms of speaking out in faith community specifically, when I was young, I was in a very conservative church that practiced male headship. But what we were told is it was okay because Christian men will protect you. But the Bible study leader of that church sexually assaulted someone. Wow. And nothing was really done. So at first I thought, oh, this is just one bad situation. So I went to another church. The exact same thing happened again. The Bible study leader there sexually assaulted someone. So I started to see there was just a bigger problem where we were being told the church was a safe space. And calling it a safe space was actually making it very dangerous because nobody was speaking out about violence. And then finally I was at another church retreat and for Native ministries, and the leader there said, you know, the biggest issue we need to face in Native communities is violence against women and children, because if we're killing ourselves from within, then we don't need to worry about the enemies from the outside. And of course now we know that Native women are 60% more likely to suffer gender violence than any other group of people. But anyway, I went home and I was telling a friend about this, and she said, do you mean other Native peoples are suffering domestic violence? And I said, well, yes, and she said, well, why aren't we talking about it? So that's another thing that impelled me to say we have to speak out about this. And the more I would just talk about it informally, the more survivors would say, yes, this is happening. And the more we can talk about it, the more we see what's happening and we have a chance to change it.
Mm. Yes. How about you, Marcia?
Well, it's a personal experience. I grew up in a household where my father he was physically abusive to me. He was physically abusive to my mother. And that seemed to be something very hereditary in the family. And so I kind of grew up feeling like I was on the color purple, you know, where you felt like you had to fight your way through just to be a young woman in the family. And so as those things came about and I got introduced into the faith-based, because my mom was an atheist, and so I was searching and seeking for God. And as I sat in the church, I began to see and hear about the various incidents that was going on in the church. So at that time, my voice was not very powerful. I just had eyes to see and ears to hear what was going on. And several years later, I was introduced to faith-based organizing and began to hear more stories. And what I began to see was not only prevalent in my life, but the life of American Black women or women, period, was that the normalized behavior for us was to be quiet, not to own our voice, and not to speak up and speak out, because growing up in a Black family, or in a lot of families back in the 60s, we're taught that, you know, what goes on in the home stays in the home. And so I figured that we had to break some generational cycles, some generational conversations, and some crippling covenants that was keeping us held bondage to our pain. And so for me, that's when I began to speak out, because I needed to not only own what happened to me, but I needed to take back ownership of my voice, and then be, you know, a voice in the wilderness for so many other women who need to own their voice as well. So mine just became a personal relationship with my pain that then catapulted me out to begin to be a catalyst for others who were subjected to domestic abuse.
Wow. Yeah, it's encouraging yet also daunting to hear that for each of you, it is a connection to this through either your own personal story or through that of others that you've encountered, because it is such a prevalent issue. And yet to know that the more that we talk about it, hopefully the more that we can address it more appropriately. And so I'd like to turn to you, Victoria, and here, knowing that domestic violence is such a high prevalent issue in our communities, and yet for many churches and congregations, it is something that is swept under the rug. It is not talked about, or at least with reluctance. And so if you would just share a bit about your work with the Kindred Moxie Network and how you're finding it's like to engage faith communities in that silence.
Absolutely. You know, through my work, it can be very challenging. Marcia and I were just talking about this a moment ago before we got started, to really get faith leaders to the table. However, it's so imperative to do so. What I found as a professional advocate for several years and as a minister as well, is that we have these faith leaders and clergy that are not experienced, that are not being trained, that are not getting any information or education while they're in seminary, while they're you know, going through an ordination process or anything like that. Yet we know from statistics that one of the first places that survivors of violence will go to for help, even before they contact the police, oftentimes, is their faith community, is their church. And they may not say anything. They may not necessarily ask the question at first, but they're coming, listening or looking for some type of solace. Is there something that's being prayed for, talked about, said, preached on? Is there a message? Is there something I can get that can help me, or that can let me know that this isn't right? Like, I'm not crazy and having to deal with this in some way. And so what I found is, in my work, how important it is to bridge the gap as a professional advocate, as someone who's done this work, who's familiar with advocacy and working on safety for survivors, and also increasing accountability of perpetrators, to really equip faith leaders and communities to be more resourceful and not roadblocks. So how I've been doing that has really come through the power of having relationships. You know, at first I was really seeking to just bring in as many people as I could, and reach out to as many faith leaders as I could for conversations, for seminars, to invite them to events that were taking place in the community that other domestic violence or better or family violence intervention programs were doing, and found that to be really, really difficult. And so I got some good information from a friend of mine who is a community organizer about really working with people who want to be there. So if it's a smaller number, to really work on building quality of relationship and depth, and really being able to go in depth more so with people who are interested and want to be there initially, versus trying to cast such a wide net and bring everyone in. Because what I found is that even when I talk with people one-on-one, when I get more info, when I have the opportunity to engage them more personally, they're really interested. They want more information. They want to do more. But sometimes, you know, then trying to get them to come to the table can be difficult. So it's really about having to really do that legwork of engaging faith communities and engaging faith leaders, and especially those who have demonstrated an interest. The other thing that's been helpful is to not present talking about domestic violence work so much as domestic violence work. People get real stigmatized about that, like, oh, I don't have that issue. I don't, you know, we don't have that problem here. So basically what I've found to be really helpful is when I've had a conversation, when I've reached out about doing community education, or even partnered with other nonprofits on engaging faith communities, we don't call it domestic violence work. Basically what we focus on is the vision we want to create. So we want to do more ultimately than just end violence. We want there to be gender equity and equality. We want there to be healthy relationships and healthy family dynamics in communities. So focusing on the vision and the goal versus only the problem really helps to bring more people to the table. Because who can argue with wanting there to be healthier families and communities and relationships? But then once you get people in the door, obviously, you know, we have that very important and direct conversation on domestic violence, but starting with getting people there with ultimately what we want to create, being vision focused. And I think that's important as advocates and as those doing this work, even to just stay engaged, because we can be so problem focused, but really seeking to talk about and really work to strategize and think about, what does it look like? What does a gender inclusive society feel like? And really work to talk about, have those conversations. And what is a gender inclusive, you know, church look like? Using inclusive language and having women in the pulpit and having women in leadership, which we find can be oftentimes, you know, rare, or still such a challenge for women in ministry. And the other thing that I found is to not present, even we do talk with faith leaders about domestic violence work, if I do use that phrase, not to present it as something that, you know, it's a problem with them we're trying to fix, but to really talk about this work and the importance of faith communities being involved as more so a way to help them. You know, I'll talk with faith leaders, I'll talk with pastors, like, I know you're busy, I know you've got 3 services you're doing, you've got Bible study, you're traveling, I get that. And I know the time that sermon prep can take, and I know that you're stretched. So this is a way to help you. What we want to do is not add more onto your plate with having more and more responsibility in the same way, but that we want to assist you. We want to connect you with the resources and the agencies in your community that can help you out. So that when someone comes to you, or, you know, and also, of course, encourage folks to talk about it, but that when you mention, even just mentioning, this is October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, someone may very well come to you and say that they need help, or that they need, or that they're dealing with this. So when that happens, who do you send them to? Who do you connect with? So wanting them to have more tools, to be equipped to know even just do's and don'ts of what to say, but also what agencies are nearby, what family violence or batterer intervention program is nearby that can really work with us, or that I can send, or that I can refer someone to if I need to, in the safest way possible. And what agencies are providing safety for survivors? So who can help them safety plan, especially if you're someone who has no idea what that is or what that looks like. But what I'm really working to do is to get faith leaders to say more than the things that are so hurtful, like just pray about it. What are you doing wrong? There must be something that he's dealing with that's making this happen, or this is a private issue. You know, these answers that are just really just are just so hurtful and so harmful to victims in particular. And just that when faith leaders know more about what's available to help them, it can make a huge difference. So I'm not trying to equip everyone to be an expert, because that's not going to happen, at least not right away. But I do want clergy and pastors and ministers to know about what's available in your area. Who can help you with this? Who can I send people to? Who can we invite to come in if we want to have this conversation? You know, and more often than not, these agencies are eager to reach out to faith communities too. So planting those seeds is what I seek to do, and where I've been able to kind of push the envelope with faith leaders and faith communities, and to get them engaged in this work.
Oh, that's so refreshing to hear. I love the way that you're approaching this issue, that it is about creating that vision and providing those practical solutions, evidence-based models, just the resources, the community resources that are available. I think that is part of tackling such an issue that is this big, is to make sure that, you know, that we are all connected to one another.
Absolutely.
One, that we're hearing the stories, that we are understanding the perspectives of victims and survivors, and so that we doesn't continue to add harm. Thank you for taking that. So we are going to turn now to, you know, that was a great picture you painted of how broad this issue is, but also the important role that faith communities play, to how it is impacting children of God all over the country. To boys and girls, and particularly we want to lift up Bresha Meadows, a young survivor of violence and domestic violence. And so good to have with us Reverend Marcia Dinkins, who has been working tirelessly in her community in Ohio with the Mahoning Valley Rising Collaborative to make sure that Bresha's story is known, that it is so we invite you, Marcia, to tell us a little bit more about Bresha and what your community and what MVOC is doing to respond to her needs.
Okay. Bresha Meadows she is now a 15-year-old young African-American girl who is being housed currently in the Juvenile Justice Detention Center in Warren, Ohio, or Trumbull County. Bresha was born into a family of abuse. Her dad had been abusing the mother for multiple years. Matter of fact, it's probably been about like 17 years. And, you know, from what has been seen is that, you know, this was a family who had to live under some very traumatic circumstances and situations, and had to fear for their lives because dad would brandish a gun not only publicly outside of their home, but in the community, inside of the home, as well as with his children, and threaten their lives as a way to maintain control with mom. And so one night, and we don't have all of, you know, story, but we do know at one night about 2-3 o'clock in the morning, Bresha heard some things with mom and dad, and then ultimately there was a call made to the police, and Bresha's dad was pronounced dead from a shot to his head. From that, you know, that alleged shooting, they allegedly state that it was Bresha. The community here is a community that does not want to have the conversation. So this just happened like July 28th. And so there's a lot of dissonance in this community. There's a lot of division. And so what we've been doing is really kind of pushing the button to have this conversation through community forums. We had a national and a local vigil to end domestic abuse. We worked with sojourners, you know, with regards to engaging faith leaders to elevate the platform. Bresha is looking at possibly being tried as an adult. And that means that she could spend the rest of her life in jail. However, even if she's not tried as an adult, she could be sentenced as an adult. So that means that she could still go from being in the juvenile detention center onto an adult facility for women. So currently we have been working not only on the local level, again, to engage and mobilize the community, to support Bresha's family, but to also stand with Bresha, to work with the national organizations asking for her release, because we want Bresha rehabilitated, not incarcerated. And that seems to be the problem. You know, people who are abused tend to be the ones who are criminalized throughout the entire process, because the person who commits the abuse here in Ohio, they get a slap on the wrist. The cases are always, you know, reduced down so that they don't get the felony. And then once the survivor pretty much gets to that point of snapping because of, you know, post-traumatic syndrome, then all of a sudden they're criminalized. And so this is what we're finding here. So what we're pushing towards is not only Bresha, but we're also pushing for a sentencing restructuring, because what we're finding is that, again, people in these situations, they find themselves being incarcerated for very long periods of time, even for the rest of their life. And again, the person who was committing the abuse for years continues to be failed by the system, which is also what happened to Bresha. You know, police officers would actually interview her in front of the dad. And so what we found that in MBOC, what we have to be is the voice in the community that begins to, you know, bring visibility to this. Because again, they don't want to talk about it. It's uncomfortable, and that's fine, you know, but I feel like this, if the systems can interrupt this young girl's life by abandoning her, then MBOC can interrupt the life of the systems so that we can ensure accountability and restructuring, so that Ms. Bresha and so many countless others who are in this situation can be rehabilitated and not incarcerated.
Yes, absolutely. You're doing such powerful work. It was such an honor to be with you a couple of weeks ago as you kicked off, you know, a vigil for your community to help support Bresha, and just the turnout there. I think there's such a vibrant need to have this discussion. There are people who need it and want it. And yet, you know, there is such stigma and shame around it. But you're pressing on, and I just commend you for that good work. And I'm so glad that you're in her hometown, making sure that she is not forgotten. And so, yeah, like to turn to you to share a bit more of, as Marcia described, you know, the criminalization of girls of color and how that is manifested in our criminal so-called justice system. If you could speak to that, and how particularly the Free Bresha campaign, of which you are an organizer for, has been trying to raise awareness about that this is a larger systemic issue that is absolutely wreaking havoc on this young girl's life. So if you would, please share a little bit with us.
Yes, thank you. I think, as Marcia mentioned, what Bresha Meadows is going through is something that's a systemic problem. Mm-hmm. Right? The police were called several times and nothing happened, and that's generally true. In cases where domestic violence leads to a murder, the police were called over 5 times, 50% of the time. Right? So the criminal justice system isn't protecting survivors, it's criminalizing. So essentially, the only legal option Bresha Meadows was given was to die. Right? So when the law is not serving you, we need to speak out. We can't assume it's going to be the answer. We have to speak out against these injustices. And an example we might be familiar with, was the case of Marissa Alexander, right? At the same time, George Zimmerman was acquitted for self-defense when he murdered someone. Marissa Alexander shot into the wall just to stop somebody from killing her, and she gets 20 years in prison. So what we see here is not just issues of sexism, but we also are seeing racism. Right? There's a legacy of women of color, poor women, women with disabilities, seen as inherently abusable, inherently rapeable. Right? It's our job to be abused. We don't deserve protection. This is something that's supposed to be natural to our communities, and it's just not the case, because this abuse is the direct legacy of indigenous genocide, slavery, racism, etc. And the state has been a big perpetrator in this. Right? The state has been a perpetrator of violence against women of color. But one of the problems we have is that most of the anti-violence programs are funded by the state. They're funded by prosecutors' offices. So they don't want to speak out when survivors are criminalized because they don't want to hurt their funding dollars. So unfortunately, we've developed an anti-violence apparatus that tends to organize around the most respectable women and doesn't want to organize those who are sex workers, who have substance abuse issues, who are criminalized, or who otherwise are marginalized in our society. And this is where I think faith communities have a particular role to play, because we know Jesus said to come to for the least of these. Right? Jesus came for the most despised, the most dejected. Jesus didn't come for the popular crowd. Right? And this is our role and responsibility and our opportunity to be Jesus here, right? To speak out for those survivors who are being criminalized, who are not getting the support from the mainstream movement, right? Who are not seen as respectable. This is our chance for a prophetic role in this movement, and I feel like we need to take this opportunity to speak out for Bresha Meadows, to ensure that she's free, but to ensure that all survivors who are being criminalized are also free.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that valuable perspective and voice, and remembering that as Christians who identify as followers of Christ, that we are to care for the least of these, and particularly those in a marginalized society, that our systems of justice or our historical legacies of racism and sexism just continues to oppress. And so to bring light to those conversations, it is a particular role and influence of faith communities that is so needed in these conversations about domestic violence. And so I want to turn to the resources that are available out there. I know there are absolutely local resources, different agencies. I know Victoria works with so many in the Atlanta area to connect faith communities to those. And absolutely, we encourage local churches and congregations to reach out to the social services and make sure that those resources are being utilized. But we also want to point faith leaders to some resources that are available to them in their unique role as preachers of the gospel, whether you're a lay leader or a person who is ordained in clergy. There are a variety of ways that we can make sure this conversation is being had, from the pulpit to the pews, because as we know, with 1 in 3 women who are impacted by domestic violence, intimate partner violence, it is very likely that someone that you are sitting with in your congregation or community has been directly impacted by this issue, or their family has, or someone that they know. And so I think it's really incumbent upon those who bear gospel light to be prepared to respond to these needs. And as Victoria mentioned, it's something I've also experienced in my seminary experiences, and likely you, Andrea, as you work in academia, that sometimes all these resources are not available, and these trainings are not spread out. And so I just want to point to a couple of resources. And again, this is not a comprehensive list, but I do want to lift up the work of We Will Speak Out US, which is a coalition of faith communities that are united against sexual and domestic violence. And so they have some incredible resources, including a sermon guide that a clergy can use. It helps to help get into the scriptures and talk about sexual and domestic violence in their communities. Also, they have a resource toolkit that gives you step-by-step of how faith communities can get engaged and appropriately respond to sexual and domestic violence. And so encourage everyone to check those resources out. And of course, we will send this as well to everyone who has tuned in, and we want to make sure that these are in your hands. As well as Sojourners, we have some resources that we think could be helpful, especially when we engage a lot in theology and how we are interpreting scripture. It's really important that we are not causing more harm. And so we have an online series that we launched last year called Troubling Texts, and this series has become an award-winning publication for us because people are finally starting to unpack what troubling said about violence and how sometimes that has been used to continue to oppress them. And so this series is an effort to really unpack some of those theologies, those troubling texts, and to find a different way to make sure that we are lifting up the sacred worth of women. And also, we've created a worship guide in support of the release of Bresha Meadows. And so we'll circulate that as well after this webinar. And then we want to be sure that you all know about ways that you can support Bresha Meadows. There are just a lot of great opportunities, a lot of good people doing incredible work to make sure that her voice is heard and not forgotten. And so one of the ways you can support her is by donating to her family, especially knowing that this is something that happened in their home. We want to make sure that they have a safe environment, perhaps a new home to go to, but more than anything, we want to make sure that Bresha is free. And so there are efforts that are being planned right now to encourage that Bresha is brought home for the holidays, and we want to make sure that she has resources available to her. And so ways that we can make that happen is through funding these efforts and making sure that her family is taken care of, especially considering the economic abuse that many families and survivors of violence endure. It's just one more way that women are kept vulnerable. And so we want to make sure that there is economic security in Bresha's family life. And so encourage everyone to donate. Also, if you would, letters out, petitions, a great one right now that has been circulated. It's getting lots of national support and attention, almost at 25,000 signatures, directed at the prosecutor in Trumbull County, Dennis Watkins. We want to make sure that he drops these charges against Bresha so that she can be home. She's turned 15 in jail, and that is just an injustice. And we want to make sure that she is getting, as Marcia says, the rehabilitation that she needs, and not to be criminalized for this. And also, we want to encourage everyone to write a letter to Bresha. Again, she's young. She feels very isolated and vulnerable. And so I think it's really helpful if we can just send her a word of encouragement, a prayer, a card. There are materials that you can send to her, and there's before you is the address in which you could do that. And then also encourage more organizations. Your faith community can do this as well. You can sign on to an endorsement at freebresha.wordpress.com, in which you can call for the release of Bresha and make sure that she is treated justly. And so that is a way, there's a way for everyone to enter into this and make sure that we are not forgetting Bresha. And so please, if you would, continue to support her. Also pray for Bresha. That is a very powerful way that you can continue to make sure that she is a part of our lives, because her story is our story. For me personally, I connected and resonated with Bresha's plight, particularly because of my own sister, who 15 years ago was a partner as a young mother. And my nephew now is the same age as Bresha, and he could very well have grown up in a household in which Bresha had to as well. And I want to make sure that no child has to endure this. And so just encourage everyone to pray for her, find ways that you can connect to others, because this is something that no one should have to go through alone, and our communities can do something together about it, particularly those of faith. And so now we're going to turn to some questions from our audience. Those who've been following along, it's been great to have you join us online via Twitter and such. And so we have a question that anyone of our speakers, if you would like to respond to. We have one from Laura Beard, who asks, how should the church respond when a woman decides to return to her abuser? Now, that's a complicated question, but what would you say to that? How should a church respond, and I would say appropriately, when a woman decides to return to her abuser?
I think it's important to recognize that most women will return home, right? They return many times before they leave.
Yep.
And there can be a tendency to actually replicate the batterer in trying to tell the survivor what they're supposed to do, right? Supporting them, helping them figure out what they're supposed to do. So I think the best thing to do is to think about helping to create a safety plan for somebody if they're returning home, rather than set it like, oh my gosh, you disappointed me. I'm not going to be here for you if you don't leave when I tell you you need to leave. But needing to be with people throughout the process, helping them think it through and help them come up with safety plans at all stages, wherever they're at, right? And there are reasons, there are good reasons why people return home. Right? People may not have another economic alternative. And women are most likely to be killed when they do leave, right? So people aren't being irrational when they return, right? They're juggling many different considerations, and the church needs to be there and support through all those considerations.
I agree. Just to support her, regardless, always letting her know that, no matter what, the church is going to support her and that the church will be there. So if she decides she wants to leave in another few months, that the church will support her regardless, with everything that Andrea said, I agree with.
Yeah.
I think for me, the first part is, I think we're kind of assuming that the church even knows what they should be doing. So I do agree with both Andrea and Victoria, because the Bible says, now therefore there is no more condemnation, or that we shouldn't judge, and we should support. But I also think that, in order for the church to be supportive of anybody, they first have to learn how to be supportive. So that they can move past their judgment and their quips and all of that, because as Andrea said, they will go back multiple times because of so many types of abuse. And the truth of the matter is, when it comes to the church is one of the main factors as to why that person goes home. I mean, if we just want to be realistic about it, the church is the reason why a lot of them go back home, because the church in and of itself wants to excuse it rather than to name it and as to what it is, and then to support through it. So for me, I think the first part in supporting her is educating yourself, so that you can then support her, without judgment, without blame, and without condemnation, because a lot of times they're already dealing with their own set of guilt and shame, and the church tends to be that shaming place again. So the church has to move past its own judgment through education, so that they can be a really good support.
That is some sound advice from all of you. Thank you. Okay, so with that, we have another question. submitted that asks, what would you say to someone who thought domestic violence is not an appropriate issue to even bring up in church? Oh, that happened.
I mean, and I've encountered that. You know, what I would say is that it is the place, it's one of the top places before calling the police, before even going to a domestic violence agency. These are according to our Georgia Fatality Review, that survivors of violence go to for help. So it's a place where people are going, and and oftentimes are asking in some way. Sometimes no, but you know, people are going, and survivors in particular are going there for help. So it's something that, you know, that can't be ignored. And it's rare to even talk with a faith leader who has said they have not dealt with this or got a story or someone has disclosed something to them. So it's coming forth. So, you know, that would be, and the fact that it's, you know, these are matters of life and death and of extreme trauma. So, you know, my response would be, you know, it's a top place people are coming to for help. You know, the church has the ability to intervene and to be a resource to really help, to help someone who is suffering. And, you know, and it's an obligation to do so, even as Christians, you know, in a church, I'll, you know, speak from that context in particular. So, I mean, yes, I've experienced, I mean, I have experienced someone asking that, but, you know, just with the prevalence of how serious it is, the nature of it, you know, it's normally been I've been able to at least make a connection with someone in regards to why this is important. And that, as Marcia even mentioned, you know, the education piece is so huge, you know, surrounding that. So even before, you know, you get those questions, it's important for, you know, for faith leaders to talk about, you know, to mention domestic violence and how prevalent it is. Even just breaking the silence about it from the pulpit, having a Bible study session on, you know, domestic violence in the Bible, from the, you know, the rape of Tamar or even Hagar. I mean, there's so many there that can be referenced because often, I mean, I've had seminarians say there's no domestic violence in the Bible when I've done sessions at ITC. I'm like, are y'all for real? So, I mean, it's something that, you know, we don't want to see, and that's often not preached about or talked about or studied even in churches, and even sometimes in seminary. You know, it's not going to be one of the first things that you come across. So, so that's my response to it. You know, and I said, and even with the scripture piece, it's in the Bible, it's in our sacred text. So it is something we have to address.
Mm.
Yeah, I think churches think if they're not saying anything, that it means it's not happening, right? But
yeah, people do think that.
Speaking about it is what's putting women's life in danger. So to say we shouldn't speak about it is to say women's life don't count. And this is consistent with the gospel that says Jesus came here to bring life for all peoples. Just to give one example, I was doing trainings for churches on domestic violence. One pastor reported that he didn't think there was domestic violence in his church, but he thought, what the heck, he'll just mention it in a sermon. So he did for like maybe 2 minutes. And after that, 50 people came to him with domestic violence happening that he didn't even know existed before, right? So the not speaking is condemning people to death, literally, right? It is a life or death issue. Speaking out, it may make the difference if somebody lives or dies.
Absolutely.
I think that when you look at the question of why would somebody tell you you shouldn't mention it in church, I think that stems from a point of a lot of different things. One is abdicating responsibility. Two, it's not about, if I don't talk about it, then I don't have to look at it in my faith. I don't have to view my own self. A lot of times when we say we shouldn't talk about something in a specific space or place, it's because we really don't want to look at what's going on in our own house. But the one thing that the Bible talks about is that our people perish for a lack of knowledge. There are multiple stories in there. And the bottom line is we are basically commissioned that when something does go on, that first of all, you should have that conversation one-on-one with the person. And even the word tells us that if you cannot pretty much work that situation out, then it does need to be brought to the church. And not only does it need to be brought to the church's attention, but it also needs to be brought forth to several people, because there's a level of accountability that must be sought. But again, we talk about it because either we don't want to talk about it because we want to abdicate the responsibility, or just the mere fact that we don't know how to handle it and we don't know how to respond. So it's better to shift it under the rug and to brush it off my shoulder than to be able to confront with you and to help you walk through your pain, and so that's why they say, the church is not the place to talk about it. But when you think about Jesus and all of those who sat at his feet, whether he sat in the sanctuary that has 4 walls to it, or a sanctuary that had 4 rocks around it, the bottom line is they talked about everything that affected those people. And part of those people are the individuals that are suffering from domestic abuse.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes, that silence is betrayal, and that silence is deafening in our faith communities when we don't take responsibility for this, don't acknowledge it, and don't respond in a way that gives life.
But you hit it on the head, Elena, when you said that silence, because when you think about how Jesus was betrayed by Judas, it was not through a pointing and a verbal to say this is him. It was through a silence, and then him just pointing out who Jesus was. And then after that came the necessary steps that led to death. So, I think that's an awesome thing right there. And we need to really, parallel that in even what we do in our churches. And see how much of this we're really bringing to the cross that we preach to our people every Sunday, and letting it die. With Jesus, we don't do that. We keep it alive by internalizing.
Yeah,
that's good.
Okay, so I know we had a late start with technology, so we're gonna wrap up, and I just want to hear if any of you have a final word that you want to share. Anything from what the FreeBresha campaign is doing and other ways that people can be supporting that effort, and to just the importance of engaging with secular partners in this work, because, the faith community won't always be the experts by any means. I think we have the theologies in which we can absolutely address some of the problems in our sacred texts and how they're being interpreted, but there needs to be that partnership with other resources in the community. And so, yeah, would anyone want to just leave a word from each of you on your encouragement for faith communities when addressing domestic violence?
Well, also just to mention, people can follow what's going on with the campaign on Twitter under the hashtag FreeBresha, and to see what are the latest things that are happening with her case. And I just want to say, I think it's important for faith groups to meet with secular groups, but also to have a diversity of groups you meet with. A lot of groups don't center the voices of women of color, right? They center the voices of the legal system. So I think it's important also to reach out to diverse groups so that you can have solidarity again with survivors of violence who don't get the same kind of attention, or who do get left behind from the mainstream movement, and work with groups like Survived and Punished, or Love and Protect, or Insight, that do work around not just interpersonal violence, but also around state violence, and are able to see the intersections together so that we can have a more comprehensive approach to end violence in all of its forms.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Well, for me, I'll just say as a closing note, really just want to reiterate some of what you said, Elena, is how crucial it is that there are, that there is the coordinated community response, which is something that we all work towards in domestic violence work, is bringing all parts of the community together. And that, domestic violence doesn't operate in a silo. It's not this one single issue, and it can't be stopped by only the faith community or only the criminal justice system or one entity. It really does take this coming together, and it really does take a connection and collaboration to bring about some type of long-lasting, sustainable change. And so, what I found, I'll just say very quickly, is that even in one of the agencies I worked with for several years, is that I found a lot of the advocates were just really completely jaded with faith communities, like didn't want to do outreach, like, oh, they cause, so many of the survivors we see have talked about how horrible of an experience they had with their faith community. Like, I don't want to deal with them. They all cause so many problems. And that was problematic in and of itself, because like, we still got to work together. There has to be that type of, we have to collaborate, and hearing their experiences and validating them, like, you're right, that's true. Yet it's still one of the top places that survivors are going to for help. So, just that working together piece, being on working together, collaborating, is so crucial. And can be so empowering, yet also very difficult at the same time, and recognizing its complexities, yet how essential it is in doing this work and achieving sustainable, long-lasting change.
Mm. Marcia, anything you want to add?
I think for me, if I had to speak to the faith leaders and to the church or to the body of Christ, period, what I would admonish each one of them to remember is that God is a God of justice. And justice went into effect because of just some verbal abuse that had happened to Eve, and where her desire had been changed, to even, move away from God into a realm that would just yield more abuse. And so when we look at God being a God of justice, we realize that we have to break the sacred secular divide. And we have to look at that in life. We all have a responsibility. And this is even indicative in the theologies that we preach, one being the Trinitarian theology, and that each one of them had a respective thing to do in our lives. But at the same time, the power that came about was the fact that you have three separate entities joining into one to mobilize the work of the Spirit. And I think as churches, we have to realize that if we're going to live our life and our calling and our commission out in Christ, that we also have to live by that